Mason, tell me I'm not seeing what I think I'm seeing. Forget the gold. If someone went through this much trouble to hide it, what do you think is behind that second door?
Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but for a teenage boy left freezing on a suburban porch, blood was exactly what betrayed him. What happens when the only thing your family leaves you is a pile of charred wood, only for its ashes to hold a multi-million-dollar secret? Rain lashed against the vinyl siding of the house like a handful of gravel thrown by an angry ghost. Leo Mitchell stood on the front porch, the freezing downpour soaking through his thin cotton jacket, his 16-year-old frame shivering uncontrollably. In his right hand, he clutched a black plastic garbage bag containing 3 pairs of jeans, a few faded t-shirts, and a photograph of his late mother. On the other side of the heavy oak door stood his father, Richard Mitchell, and his stepmother, Brenda. "Don't come back until you learn some respect, you ungrateful parasite." Richard's voice had boomed just moments before the deadbolt clicked shut with a sickening finality. Brenda had stood behind him, her arms crossed, a smug, satisfied smile playing on her lips. She had been working toward this moment for 3 years, whispering poison into Richard's ear, framing Leo for stolen money, broken liquor bottles, and every argument that echoed through their hollow home. Tonight, the final lie, a staged theft of Brenda's diamond tennis bracelet, had been the catalyst. Richard had not asked for Leo's side of the story. He had simply pointed to the door. For hours, Leo sat on the edge of the porch, hoping the door would open, hoping the man who had raised him would suddenly remember he was a father. The door never opened. The next 5 years were a brutal education in survival. Leo learned the hard way how to sleep with one eye open in Greyhound bus terminals, how to wash his hair in public library sinks, and how to stretch a $1 menu cheeseburger over 2 days. The world was a cold, indifferent machine, and he was entirely alone in it. Eventually, he found himself in the gritty industrial outskirts of Portland, Oregon, where an aging, chain-smoking mechanic named Henry Dawson took pity on him. Henry owned Dawson's Auto Repair, a crumbling cinder-block garage that smelled perpetually of motor oil, stale coffee, and ozone. Henry gave Leo a cot in the back room and a minimum-wage job sweeping floors. Over time, that evolved into wrenching on engines, replacing transmissions, and rebuilding carburetors. For the first time since his mother died, Leo had something resembling stability. Then came the Tuesday afternoon that shattered his quiet, grease-stained existence. Leo was 21, sliding out from under a rusted Ford pickup, wiping his blackened hands on a shop towel, when a man in a pristine charcoal suit stepped into the garage. The man looked entirely out of place among the scattered tools and oil slicks. He introduced himself as Jonathan Carmichael, a senior partner at Carmichael and Hayes, a prestigious law firm downtown. "Leo Mitchell?" the lawyer asked, his eyes scanning the young man's ragged appearance. "I represent the estate of your maternal grandfather, Harrison Montgomery. I'm afraid he passed away last Thursday." Leo froze. Harrison Montgomery had been a titan in the commercial real estate world, a man of immense wealth and sharp intellect. But Richard had entirely cut Harrison out of Leo's life after Leo's mother passed, forbidding any contact. "I need you to attend the reading of the will tomorrow morning," Carmichael said, handing Leo a thick, embossed card. "It is highly imperative that you are there." The following morning, Leo sat in a plush leather chair in a sprawling corner office overlooking the city skyline. He had worn his only suit, bought from a thrift store, which hung awkwardly on his lean shoulders. Across the mahogany table sat Richard and Brenda. They looked like royalty. Richard wore a custom Italian suit, and Brenda was dripping in pearls, her face a mask of poorly concealed greed. When they saw Leo enter, Richard's jaw tightened, and Brenda let out a soft, derisive scoff. They hadn't spoken in 5 years, and Richard didn't even offer a nod of acknowledgement. Carmichael cleared his throat and began to read the last will and testament of Harrison Montgomery. The estate was staggering, liquid assets exceeding $40 million, commercial properties across the Pacific Northwest, a controlling stake in Oak Haven Holdings. Leo listened, his heart pounding, wondering if his grandfather had remembered him. "To my son-in-law, Richard Mitchell, and his wife Brenda, I leave the entirety of the liquid assets, the primary residence in Lake Oswego, and the controlling shares of Oak Haven Holdings." Carmichael read. Brenda gasped in delight, clutching Richard's arm. Richard puffed out his chest, a victorious gleam in his eye. They had won. They had manipulated the old man in his failing years and secured the empire. "And finally," Carmichael continued, his tone shifting slightly, "to my grandson, Leo Mitchell, I leave the parcel of land located at 4,409, Route 9 inches Jasper County, and all the structures upon it. Richard let out a booming laugh. The old dairy property? You've got to be kidding me. That place has been abandoned for 20 years. Furthermore, Carmichael added, ignoring Richard, that structure burned to the ground in a devastating fire 2 years ago. The insurance deemed it a total loss. You have inherited a charred foundation, Leo. I am incredibly sorry. Brenda leaned across the table, her eyes glittering with malice. Looks like you finally got what you deserve, Leo. A pile of ashes. Try not to track soot on the carpet on your way out. Leo felt the blood drain from his face. He didn't care about the millions. He cared that his grandfather, the only blood relative who might have loved him, had seemingly mocked him from the grave. Leaving him an abandoned, burned-down barn while giving his abusers a vast fortune felt like a final, cruel joke. An hour later, Leo drove Henry's beat-up loaner truck out to Jasper County. The drive took him deep into rural territory, past dying farm towns and overgrown fields. When he finally pulled up to 4,409 Route 9, the reality of his inheritance hit him like a physical blow. It was worse than he had imagined. The once massive barn was nothing but a blackened skeletal frame reaching up toward the gray sky. Piles of charred timber, melted tin roofing, and gray ash choked the foundation. The smell of old smoke and wet rot hung heavy in the damp air. Weeds had begun to push their way through the destruction, reclaiming the ruin. Leo killed the engine and stepped out into the quiet desolation. He walked slowly toward the center of the wreckage, his boots crunching on scorched wood and shattered glass. He stood in the middle of his inheritance, surrounded by the ghosts of a forgotten past. The injustice of it all finally broke the dam he had built around his emotions. He fell to his knees in the wet ash, his hands gripping the charred earth, and screamed until his throat was raw. He had survived the streets. He had survived the cold. But this felt like the world deliberately crushing his spirit. Why? Why would Harrison do this to him? Leo lowered his head, staring blankly at the ruined floor. But as his tears hit the dust, the water cleared a small patch of ash near his knee. Beneath the thick layer of gray, Leo's eyes caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong in a wooden barn. It was the dull, heavy gleam of brushed steel. Leo wiped his eyes, his breathing slowing, as a strange sense of clarity washed over him. He reached out with his bare, grease-calloused hands and began to frantically claw at the wet ash and debris. The soot coated his skin, turning his hands pitch black, but he didn't stop. He pushed aside a heavy, charred support beam, grunting with the effort, his muscles straining against the waterlogged wood. Beneath the beam lay a thick layer of melted roofing tin. Leo grabbed a rusted iron rod from the debris and used it as a lever, prying the tin upward with a loud shriek of bending metal. He tossed it aside and fell back to his knees, sweeping away the last layers of soot. There, perfectly flush with the poured concrete foundation of the barn, was a massive, industrial-grade floor safe. It was a beast of a machine, forged from thick tungsten and solid steel, entirely impervious to the fire that had raged above it 2 years prior. It had a heavy rotary combination dial and a thick T-shaped drop-forged handle. It was the kind of safe banks used for overnight deposits, deeply embedded into the earth, practically unmovable. Leo stared at it, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. You have inherited a charred foundation, Leo, and all the structures upon it. The lawyer's words echoed in his mind. The barn wasn't the inheritance. The barn was just the camouflage. But how was he supposed to open it? Leo brushed the remaining dust off the dial. There were 100 numbers on the wheel. Trying to crack it by brute force would take lifetimes. He sat back on his heels, his mind racing, trying to dig through childhood memories. Harrison had been a meticulous man, a man of puzzles and intentionality. He wouldn't have left Leo a locked vault without giving him the key. Think, Leo. He remembered the last time he had seen his grandfather. It was just weeks before Leo's mother died. Harrison had come to the house, slipping past Richard's watchful eye. He had knelt down, hugged a young Leo tightly, and pressed a heavy silver pocket watch into his small hands. Time is the only thing they can't steal from you, Leo, Harrison had whispered. Keep this safe. And remember, the hands only stop when the real work begins. Leo had carried that watch every single day since he was kicked out. It had been his one anchor to his past. He reached into the inner pocket of his thrift store suit jacket and pulled it out. The silver casing was scratched and dented from years on the streets, but the glass face was intact. He clicked the top button. The cover sprang open. The watch had stopped ticking years ago. He had never had the money to get it repaired, so the hands had remained frozen in place. The hour hand rested perfectly on the 4, The minute hand was pointed directly at the 17. The second hand was dead center on the 32. 4到17, 32. Leo's breath hitched. His hands were trembling as he leaned over the heavy steel dial. He gripped the cold metal, turning it clockwise past 0 a few times to clear the mechanism. Slowly, carefully, he dialed right to 4. He reversed direction, spinning the wheel left, passing the 4 once, and stopping dead on 17. Finally, he turned the dial back to the right, landing perfectly on 32. Silence hung over the burned barn. The only sound was the distant caw of a crow. Leo reached for the thick steel T-handle. He gripped it with both hands, braced his boots against the concrete, and pulled. With a deep, mechanical clunk that seemed to vibrate through the very earth, the locking bolts retracted. The massive steel door groaned, its heavy hinges screaming in protest after years of neglect, but it lifted. A stale rush of preserved cold air hit Leo's face as he pulled the heavy lid open, letting it rest against the concrete. Inside the dark cavity lay no stacks of $100 bills. There were no gold bars, no sparkling jewels. Instead, the safe was packed with rows of leather-bound journals, a series of thick manila folders, a digital hard drive sealed in an anti-static bag, and a single, crisp white envelope with his name written on it in his grandfather's elegant cursive. Leo reached in, his fingers leaving dark soot marks on the clean white paper. He tore the envelope open and pulled out the heavy cardstock letter inside. My dearest Leo, if you are reading this, it means my lawyer followed my instructions, and it means you are standing in the ruins of the Jasper County barn. I know what the will said. I know how it looked. You must forgive an old man for his deception, but it was the only way to keep you safe. Richard and Brenda think they have won. For the last decade, they have been slowly poisoning me, isolating me, and quietly siphoning millions from Oak Haven Holdings into offshore shell companies registered under Brenda's maiden name. When I finally uncovered their massive web of fraud and embezzlement, I was already too weak to fight them in the light. I compiled every wire transfer, every forged signature, every illegal transaction they ever made. I gathered enough evidence to put them both in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. But they found out I knew. 2 days after I moved the evidence into this vault, they hired an arsonist to burn the barn down, believing the documents were hidden in the loft. They never knew about the foundation safe. They stole your youth, Leo. They stole my company. They stole our family. I left them the estate in the will so they would feel secure, so they would not suspect that the true inheritance was given to you. Inside this vault is the blade. You are the executioner. Take it all back. Love, grandfather. Leo stared at the letter, the words blurring together as a profound, terrifying heat began to rise in his chest. A slow, dark smile crept onto his face, cracking the layer of soot on his cheeks. He looked down at the neatly stacked folders, the ledgers detailing every crime his father and stepmother had committed. He had come to this property feeling like a victim, a discarded piece of trash left to rot in the ashes. But as he began to load the heavy journals and hard drives into his garbage bag, replacing his old clothes with the instruments of his revenge, he knew everything had changed. Richard and Brenda thought they had inherited an empire. They didn't realize they had just handed Leo the match to burn it all down. Rain continued to batter the Pacific Northwest, turning the streets of Portland into slick mirrors of neon and shadow. Inside the drafty back office of Dawson's Auto Repair, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and burning ambition. Leo Mitchell sat hunched over a grease-stained folding table, the faint blue light of a borrowed laptop, illuminating his exhausted but intensely focused face. For 3 days and 3 nights, Leo had not slept. He had consumed Harrison Montgomery's journals like a starving man at a banquet. The meticulous handwriting of his late grandfather laid out a financial conspiracy, so sprawling and arrogant that it made Leo's blood run cold. Richard and Brenda had not just skimmed off the top of Oak Haven Holdings. They had systematically hollowed out the foundation of the commercial real estate empire. Through a labyrinth of offshore shell companies, cleverly registered under variations of Brenda's maiden name, they had funneled over $60 million out of the corporate accounts. They used inflated contractor invoices, phantom consulting fees, and manipulated property appraisals. Harrison's hard drive contained the digital smoking guns, unredacted bank statements, unauthorized wire transfers, and internal emails where Richard explicitly detailed the embezzlement strategy. "You're going to burn a hole through that screen, kid," a gravelly voice interrupted. Leo looked up, blinking away the strain in his eyes. Henry Dawson stood in the doorway, a mug of black coffee in his calloused hand. The older mechanic had watched Leo drag the heavy garbage bag into the shop 3 days ago, covered in soot and shaking with a terrifying, silent energy. Henry hadn't asked questions. He had simply locked the garage doors and brought Leo food. "They're trying to cash out, Henry," Leo said, his voice raspy. He turned the laptop screen toward the old mechanic. "I found a hidden folder on the drive. It's an acquisition proposal. Richard and Brenda are forcing a merger with a massive private equity firm in Chicago. They're going to sell Oakhaven Holdings, liquidate their majority shares, and disappear with the cash before the board of directors realizes the company's internal accounts are empty." Henry frowned, squinting at the complex financial spreadsheets. "When is this supposed to happen?" "The shareholder vote and the final contract signing are scheduled for this Friday," Leo replied, glancing at the calendar on the wall. "That's 48 hours from now. If they sign those papers, the money vanishes into the Cayman Islands, and they walk away completely untouched." Leo slammed the laptop shut, the sharp sound echoing in the quiet garage. "I need to stop them, but I can't just walk into a corporate boardroom looking like a vagrant and waving a stolen hard drive. They'll have security throw me out, or worse, Richard will have me arrested for trespassing." Henry took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes locking onto Leo's. He saw the fire in the young man's eyes, the same fire that had allowed him to survive 5 brutal years on the streets. Without a word, Henry turned and walked out to the main garage floor. He approached a heavy, battered red snap-on tool chest, unlocked the bottom drawer, and pulled out a faded metal lockbox. Walking back into the office, Henry dropped the box onto the folding table. It landed with a heavy metallic thud. He popped the latch, revealing stacks of crisp $100 bills bound in rubber bands. "That's my retirement," Henry said, his voice completely steady. $35,000. Blood, sweat, and busted knuckles. Leo stared at the money, entirely paralyzed. "Henry, I can't take this. If this fails—" "It won't fail," Henry interrupted fiercely. "I took you in when you were a stray dog, Leo. I watched you work 80-hour weeks without a single complaint. You are more of a son to me than anyone else in this world. This money doesn't mean a damn thing if you don't get your justice. You take this cash, you buy the sharpest suit in this city, and you hire the most ruthless shark of a lawyer you can find." Tears pricked the corners of Leo's eyes, but he blinked them away, nodding slowly. He grabbed his phone and pulled up the business card Jonathan Carmichael had given him. But he didn't dial Carmichael's extension. He looked up the directory for Carmichael and Hayes and found the man he truly needed, Arthur Hayes. Hayes was the firm's senior litigation partner, a man notorious in the Pacific Northwest for his aggressive, scorched-earth courtroom tactics. 2 hours later, Leo walked into the polished glass lobby of Carmichael and Hayes. He was still wearing his thrift store clothes, but his posture had fundamentally changed. He no longer walked like a victim. He walked like a man holding a loaded weapon. Arthur Hayes sat behind a massive oak desk, a man in his late 50s with sharp, predatory eyes and a tailored navy suit. He looked at Leo with a mixture of amusement and irritation when the young man bypassed his secretary and dropped a thick manila folder onto the pristine desk. "Mr. Mitchell, I presume," Hayes said, leaning back. "Jonathan told me about your inheritance. I'm busy, so whatever grievance you have regarding the burnt barn—" "I don't care about the barn," Leo interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. "I care about the $64 million Richard and Brenda Mitchell stole from my grandfather. And I care about the federal racketeering charges you are going to help me file." Hayes raised an eyebrow, a skeptical smile playing on his lips. "That is quite a bold accusation for a boy off the street. Do you have any concept of the burden of proof required for—" "Open the folder," Leo commanded. Hayes paused, his eyes narrowing. He reached forward and flipped open the heavy cover. His eyes scanned the first page, a direct wire transfer from Oakhaven's emergency reserve to a shell corporation in Belize, bearing Richard's forged signature. Hayes flipped to the next page, then the next. The skeptical smile vanished from the lawyer's face, replaced by a look of profound, chilling shock. "There are 300 pages in that folder," Leo stated, pacing the length of the office, "and a hard drive containing the digital metadata for every single transaction. They are signing a merger this Friday to liquidate the assets and flee." Hayes looked up, his predatory eyes now gleaming with dangerous excitement. This was the kind of case that made a lawyer's career legendary. "What do you want to do, Leo?" Hayes asked, his tone shifting entirely from dismissive to deeply respectful. "I want to wait until they are in that boardroom," Leo said, stepping up to the desk and leaning down until he was eye level with the lawyer. "I want them to be holding the pen. I want them to think they have won. And then, Mr. Hayes, I want you to help me burn their entire world to the ground." Friday morning broke with a crisp, bitter chill. The 52nd floor of the Oakhaven Holdings Tower offered a panoramic, God's-eye view of the Seattle skyline, the steel and glass monuments gleaming under the pale morning sun. Inside the primary executive boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, catered espresso, and unchecked arrogance. Richard Mitchell stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, adjusting his silk tie. He looked the part of a conquering emperor. Beside him sat Brenda, wearing a sleek designer dress, her diamonds catching the overhead lights. She was sipping sparkling water, suppressing a triumphant grin. Surrounding them were the 12 members of the Oakhaven board, along with 3 suited representatives from the Chicago private equity firm. In the center of the table rested the merger agreement, a stack of papers worth over $400 million. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice booming with artificial warmth, "today marks a new era for Oakhaven. My late father-in-law, Harrison Montgomery, built this company from the ground up. But it takes a new vision to carry it into the future. This merger secures that future." The board members nodded in polite agreement, completely unaware that the corporate treasury was bleeding out. "If there are no further questions," the lead Chicago executive said, unrolling a gold fountain pen, "we can execute the signatures and finalize the transfer of controlling shares." Richard reached for the pen, his fingers trembling slightly with pure greed. He pressed the gold nib against the heavy paper. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open with a violent crack, shattering the polite silence of the room. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Leo Mitchell. He was unrecognizable from the shivering, soaked teenager who had been thrown onto the street 5 years prior. Leo wore a bespoke, charcoal gray 3-piece suit courtesy of Henry's retirement fund and a masterful overnight tailor. His hair was sharply styled, his shoulders squared, and his jaw set in stone. He looked remarkably, terrifyingly like Harrison Montgomery in his prime. Flanking him on his left was Arthur Hayes, clutching a thick leather briefcase. On his right stood 2 men wearing plain, dark suits with subtle earpieces, federal agents from the SEC's Criminal Investigative Division. "The pen stays on the table, Richard," Leo said, his voice cutting through the room like a physical blade. Richard froze, the blood instantly draining from his face. He stared at his estranged son, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Leo, what is the meaning of this? Security! How did he get up here?" Brenda stood up, her chair screeching against the hardwood floor. "You little rat, get out of this building immediately!" "This building," Arthur Hayes announced, stepping forward with a booming, authoritative voice, "belongs to the estate of Harrison Montgomery. And as of this morning, an emergency injunction has been filed to freeze all assets, transfers, and mergers associated with Oakhaven Holdings." The Chicago executives exchanged alarmed glances, pulling their documents back from the center of the table. The board members erupted into a chorus of confused murmurs. "Injunction?" Richard sputtered, attempting to maintain his facade of authority. "On what grounds? I am the sole inheritor of the controlling shares." Leo walked slowly toward the table, his eyes locked dead onto his father's. He didn't blink. He didn't waver. "On the grounds of massive, systemic, and prolonged corporate fraud," Leo stated calmly. He reached into Hayes's briefcase and pulled out a stack of the manila dossiers he and Henry had painstakingly assembled. He tossed them onto the polished mahogany. They slid across the table, stopping in front of the board members and the Chicago investors. "Over the last 10 years," Leo continued, his voice ringing through the silent room, "Richard and Brenda Mitchell have embezzled $64 million from this company. The proof is in those folders. Account numbers, wire transfers, forged signatures, all of it." A board member opened a dossier, his eyes scanning the top page. He gasped audibly, "Richard, what is this?" "This is the reserve account for the downtown development." "It's a lie!" Brenda shrieked, her perfectly manicured facade cracking into pure panic. She pointed a shaking finger at Leo. "He forged those! He's a delinquent! A thief! We kicked him out of the house because he's a liar." "The FBI's forensic accounting unit doesn't seem to think so," Arthur Hayes countered smoothly. He gestured to the 2 federal agents standing near the door. "In fact, they verified the metadata on the digital files 3 hours ago. The warrants were signed by a federal judge at 8 a.m. The agents stepped forward, pulling out their badges. "Richard Mitchell, Brenda Mitchell, you are both under investigation for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and federal racketeering. We need you to step away from the table." Complete chaos erupted in the boardroom. The private equity investors shoved their chairs back, horrified at the legal nightmare they had almost signed into. Brenda spun around, her eyes wide with terror, and grabbed Richard's arm. "Do something! Fix this, Richard! Tell them! But Richard was broken. He stared at the dossiers, then looked up at Leo. The arrogant tyrant was gone, replaced by a pathetic, terrified man who had finally been trapped by his own hubris. You burned the barn, Richard whispered, his voice trembling. You found the safe. Grandfather left me a foundation, Leo replied, stepping directly into Richard's personal space. He looked down at the man who had abandoned him to the freezing rain. He knew exactly what you were. He knew I would dig through the ashes to find the truth. The federal agents flanked Richard and Brenda, producing heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clicks echoed sharply in the room. Brenda began to sob hysterically, fighting against the agent's grip, mascara running down her cheeks. Leo, please, Richard begged, his voice cracking as his arms were wrenched behind his back. I'm your father. You can't do this to your own family. Leo adjusted his cuffs, his expression completely devoid of pity. He looked at his father, letting the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment. Don't come back until you learn some respect, Leo said softly, echoing the exact words Richard had spoken to him 5 years ago. You ungrateful parasite. He turned his back as the agents hauled the screaming couple out of the glass boardroom. The heavy doors swung shut, leaving behind a stunned silence among the board of directors. Leo walked to the head of the table. He looked down at the gold pen resting on the unsigned merger document. He picked it up, capped it, and slipped it into his pocket. He then looked up at the remaining executives, his grandfather's fierce intellect shining in his eyes. Now, Leo Mitchell said, taking his rightful seat at the head of the empire. Let's get to work. 6 months later, a heavy wooden gavel fell in the federal courthouse of downtown Seattle. The sterile, packed courtroom had closely followed the explosive downfall of the Mitchell family. Federal Judge Thomas Gallagher looked down from his high bench at Richard and Brenda, who were now wearing matching Orange County-issued jumpsuits. The trial had been a brutal dissection of their decade-long conspiracy, during which the fragile alliance between husband and wife had spectacularly shattered. Brenda had attempted to secure a lenient plea deal by testifying against Richard, claiming she was merely a naive wife following orders. Enraged, he had retaliated by releasing secret audio recordings of her, directly orchestrating the bribery of property appraisers. They had entirely destroyed each other on the public stage. I have rarely seen such calculated, malicious, and arrogant theft, Judge Gallagher announced, his voice echoing through the silent room. You systematically defrauded your own family, destroyed a legacy, and attempted to flee the country. Richard Mitchell, Brenda Mitchell, I hereby sentence you both to 22 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. Brenda collapsed against the defense table, wailing loudly, while Richard stood entirely paralyzed. Leo watched the scene unfold with calm detachment. He wore a sharp, tailored Navy suit, looking every bit the formidable CEO he had become. Before their transfer to the penitentiary, Leo requested a brief, monitored meeting in the holding room. He sat across from his father and stepmother at a scarred metal table. Brenda glared at him, her tear-streaked face twisted in a venomous sneer. You think you're so smart, you arrogant street rat. You found the safe, but Harrison didn't know about the Zurich accounts. My sister Cynthia has the routing numbers. When I get out, I'll still be richer than you could ever imagine. Leo did not react to her venom. Instead, he slowly slid a folded piece of paper across the metal table. Richard opened it with trembling, handcuffed wrists. It was a bank statement from a highly secure Swiss financial institution, registered under Cynthia. The balance at the bottom read, $0. Brenda gasped, the color draining from her face. No, that's impossible. No one knew about that account. Grandfather was a meticulous man, Leo said softly. He didn't just leave me the floor safe, he left me his pocket watch. I had the watch cleaned recently, and the jeweler found a micro-engraving inside the casing. It was a list of 4 routing numbers. You thought you were hiding money, but he tracked every single cent. Federal authorities seized the Zurich funds on Tuesday. Leo stood up, buttoning his jacket, looking down at the broken people who had once discarded him. You have nothing left, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. No money, no legacy, no family. Enjoy the next 22 years. He walked out, ignoring Brenda's hysterical screams and Richard's defeated silence. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, severing his ties to them forever. Later that afternoon, Leo drove his sleek SUV to the gritty industrial district, pulling up to Dawson's Auto Repair. Henry Dawson was wiping grease from his hands, a proud gleam in his tired eyes. Saw the news? Henry said, smiling. 22 years. Guess Arthur Hayes earned his paycheck. He did, Leo agreed, placing a heavy leather envelope on the workbench. But I came to settle my debt. You don't owe me a dime, kid. I gave you that money because I believed in you. Open it, Henry. Henry unclasped the envelope, finding legal documents and a set of shiny keys. His eyes widened in absolute shock. Leo, this is a commercial deed to the 3-acre industrial lot on 4th Avenue. It's being gutted and renovated as we speak, Leo smiled warmly. State-of-the-art hydraulic lifts, climate-controlled bays, and a massive showroom. It's fully paid for. The sign goes up next week. Dawson and Mitchell Automotive. You're the head of operations. It's time you stopped working in the cold. Tears finally broke through the veteran mechanic's tough exterior. He reached out, pulling Leo into a fierce, crushing hug. Thank you, son. A week later, Leo drove out to Jasper County under a bright, clear morning sun. The charred wood, ash, and ruined foundation of the burned barn had been completely excavated. In its place, a massive crew was pouring fresh concrete and raising sturdy steel beams. Leo stood at the edge of the site, pulling his grandfather's silver pocket watch from his coat. The internal gears were finally fixed. It ticked steadily, keeping perfect, unbroken time. He looked up at the large wooden sign near the highway. Future home of the Montgomery Foundation for Youth Transition, providing shelter, education, and hope for displaced teenagers. Fire doesn't just destroy. Sometimes, it clears the ground for a much stronger foundation. Blood may be thicker than water, but the truth is always stronger than fire. Leo Mitchell turned the ashes of a cruel, calculated joke into the powerful foundation of a new empire, proving that the greatest treasures are often hidden in the darkest places. If you enjoyed this story of ultimate revenge and poetic justice, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist. And make sure to subscribe so you never miss our next dramatic tale.
Hi, my name is Nguyen Duen, the owner and manager of Coyote Frontier Hearts. After watching the video, Evicted at 19, we inherited a creepy locked basement. The gold inside shocked the town. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the feeling of resilience. Watching someone face rejection, hardship and loss, yet keep moving forward, makes this story feel less about treasure and more about perseverance. Sometimes the biggest discoveries come after the moments when life seems to have given us nothing at all. I'd love to know what stood out to you most. Was it the hidden secret itself, or the determination it took to uncover it? And if you were in that situation, would you have kept searching when everything seemed hopeless? One gentle lesson I took from this story is that not every setback is the end of the road. Sometimes patience, curiosity, and persistence reveal opportunities we never expected. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about second chances and unexpected discoveries, a like or subscription is always appreciated.